So this is just going over the Godot interface. So when you open Godot, it's going to look like this. If you don't open a project, if you just open Godot directly, you're going to get this project manager window. And you don't really have to use this, but you can create a new project here. So you can make a new project and set it up. We're starting with this template, so there's some stuff that I've already set up for you guys. So you can just open that directly. So as we looked at before, you can go into the template and just double click on the project.godot. You can have multiple Godot projects open at the same time. So I could also open like another thing that I'm working on. I just click the edit button and it'll have both of them open. You don't necessarily want to do that because it can get kind of confusing. So I'm just if you want the project in the project manager and it's not there, you don't necessarily have to have it this way. But let's say you've got your project and you just opened it directly, but it's not here. So I'm gonna just remove this. So the way that you would get the project into the project manager, so it'll show up here, is you use the scan button. So you just click scan, and then you have to find it on your computer. So the Godot little file interface is kind of similar to the normal file explorer, but it's a little bit different. So one thing is you can type the path that you want just directly into there. But you can also look for stuff. So I'm in the C drive and I'm in users / my name / documents, but that's not where I want to be. So I have to go back, right? So I have to hit this back button and that takes me back to my main folder. So then I can go into Owen and go to desktop, go to MEA 300, find my 3D game template, and I don't want to go into this folder. I just want to select this and then click select this folder. And now we see that project is in my editor project manager. So if I want to edit this project, I just click the edit button and that brings us back to Godot. So this is the default window for Godot. One of the nice things about Godot is it's highly customizable. I can move these different tabs around. I can change the sizes of things. I can change the colors. There's a lot of different things that I can change to change the look. I'm going to leave it at the default just so it looks familiar. But there's a lot of stuff you can change in here. And one thing that might be useful, the way it's set up right now, it's probably kind of hard to see it on the screen because it's the text is very small. I can go into the editor settings and I can change things about the interface. So again, I just went up to editor and the first one is editor settings. That brings up a new little window. I can change the display scale, so I can make the whole thing bigger or smaller. I can set a custom display scale. I can change the main font size. I can change the code font size. There's a lot of things I can change in here. I'm going to try scaling it up a little bit. One thing that it'll tell you is if you want to change the way the editor looks, you have to restart it. So it says the editor must be restarted for change. Click save and restart. Should open up to where I was before. Okay, so now that's a little bit zoomed in. Maybe it's a little bit easier for you guys to see on the screen. So I can change the colors. There's a layout, so I can save a certain layout that I want. This is the default layout. I guess I don't remember making this, but I guess I made a class layout. It's just wider. That's cool. So you can make a layout. If you have a layout that you really like, you can save it as your own layout. So similar to a lot of other programs. So we can go over the basic areas. There's obviously one big area in the middle where you do your editing. That's where you do most of your work and you can see what you're creating. When you first open it up by default, you're just going to have an empty scene. So it's not saved anywhere. You can do stuff in here, but until you save it, it's not actually saved on your computer. But we're actually going to get to this in a little bit. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the file system, which is down here. It's in the bottom left corner. I'm going to talk about this a lot because one of the things I'm going to emphasize a lot in this class is file management, always knowing where your project files are and how to get things from one place to another, making sure everything is synced up. This is like super, super important, even though it's kind of boring. You really need to be able to do 3D projects. There's lots of different parts. And so you need to know where they all are. Having things very organized is really important. So one of the nice things about this is it shows you what it looks like on your computer. If I right click on this RES right here is the main folder for my project. RES is short for resources. If I right click on here and I go to open in file manager, it's going to take me to the part of my computer where this actually is. So I can see, I'm on my PC, on my desktop, in my class folder, in my template folder. And I can see my project.godot, I can see all this different stuff. So I can always find where it is on my computer if I want to put new assets in there or import or move things around. Then inside here, I have my main folders. And the way different people organize different things different ways. I like to organize things by what type of asset they are. There's a lot of different types of assets in 3D, so we'll go over those. The basic assets that I've created for you guys in this demo project is materials. Talk about that a lot more later, but materials are basically like the surface of the objects in your scene. There's scenes. These are like the organization of your project. It's like levels, but it's also like menus and components. So the only scene in here is this player scene, which is this little player guy that you drive around the scene. There's scripts. This is for code. So right now we only have one script, which is the player controller. We'll talk a little bit about this next week. But any script, any code that we're going to write is going to go in that scripts folder. And then there's textures. Textures are images that we wrap around our objects, and textures and materials go together to create what the surface of the object looks like. So that's just like the real basics. We'll learn about new things, as we start to build things out. There's always a default underscore env, and this is where we can set certain things about our environment. So I can set things like the background, if we want a sky, or canvas, different things here. What type of sky we're using. There's all sorts of stuff in here. Ambient light, fog. There's all sorts of stuff in here. We're not really going to spend a lot of time on this stuff because this class is not really about like graphics necessarily. It's more about design and interaction. There was going to be a class about that kind of stuff this semester, but they're pushing it later. But the animation department is going to have a really good class about like that type of graphic stuff. That's something that and then there's an icon. The icon is just like what shows up when you run the game. So you don't really need that, but it's good to have it there. I also have this folder called ignore. I'll go over this more in the future, but this is where I make stuff if I want to test it out. And the reason the folder is called ignore is because it doesn't get added to that GitHub project. So I have some scenes in here that I was like testing out, but I didn't want that to be part of the main project and for you guys to download it because it adds stuff that you don't need. So if you look at the main project, you see everything except that. And there's actually a little file in here called git ignore, which ignores certain files that we don't want to put in our code base folder, because they're things that our computer makes that we don't really need. So for example, Godot makes all these files called import files, where if you add an image, it makes like a little extra file that helps Godot know what's in that file. But you don't need that because your computer creates it when you run the program. So we're going to ignore that. The only files we want to put in our project repository are the files that are necessary to run the project. So those are like the images, the code, the scenes, things like that. So yeah, that's what's in here. One other thing real quick, just so you guys see this, this is what a scene looks like in Godot. It's just text. Okay, so it's just a bunch of text that tells Godot how to put. So these files are really just like text files with lots of little pieces of information in them. That's all we're really creating, but we're using this visual interface to do. Okay, so that's the file system. We'll be using a lot. We're gonna move on for now. Right above the file system is the scene window. This is the one that I think is like the most confusing to refer to because it's called scene, but this looks like our scene, right? When I talk about the scene hierarchy or the node hierarchy or the scene window, I'm talking about this window right here. And it's a really important window because it's where we set up the hierarchy of the scene. Every scene in Godot has a main, they call this a node. So a node is just like one part. So every scene in Godot has a main node. So this player scene is just the player. So the main node is called player, and everything else goes inside of there. And we'll talk about what all those little things are in a bit. So then when we're editing the scene, we can move stuff around, we can add stuff. So the plus button is for adding new nodes to our scene. And the link button is for adding instances. So adding other scenes inside of. And it's easy. There's a couple things that make this easier to use. So I can filter the nodes. So if I have eventually when you have a complex scene, you're going to have like a big list of different things. So if you're looking for something like I need to find the player's head, I can type in the filter here and it'll filter out the other nodes that I don't want. There's also icons here. So there's like an eyeball. If I turn this stuff on and off, I can see what's in the scene. The script icon means that there's a program attached to this node. So if I click on that, it'll take me over here to the code editor. Sometimes you'll see, let's just add it real quick. You'll see something like this, or no, this one. So you can lock a node so that you can't move it or edit it. So that's useful if you've got a lot of stuff and you don't want to mess it up. You can lock your nodes. So if I lock this mesh instance, I can't move it around in the scene. And then I can unlock it. And then this one makes the children not selectable. So if I do that, this deselect thing, well, I shouldn't be. Huh. Oh, maybe I'm just translating the player. Let's lock it. And okay, yeah. So then I can't select these other parts. I can only select the player. Anyway, so you can lock stuff down if you don't want to mess up part of your scene while you're editing another part of the scene. So yeah, you're going to be adding stuff there and then editing it in the main viewer area. So then this import tab, we're probably not going to use that a whole lot, but you can change the way things are imported. So for example, if I have a texture, I made this like little grid texture. There's some different there's some different like parameters about how the texture is rendered in the scene that you can change. We're probably not going to use this a lot. We might use it for audio stuff if we do that, but pretty much we don't really need to use this very much. So we can ignore that. Okay, so that's the left side. So now let's look at our main viewer. So this is where things get kind of complicated, and this is where your sort of like your biggest learning curve is going to be when it comes to doing 3D design and working with Godot. The nice thing is that most of these 3D programs kind of work the same way. They have like similarities, but there's a lot of different stuff that you need to be able to do. So I'm going to close this and just have an empty scene and just talk about the basic stuff. So reason you need a mouse like this is because there's a lot of different ways you can manipulate the scene, and you need to be able to do that to edit it correctly. So when I'm moving the mouse around, if I use the scroll wheel, I can zoom in and out of the scene. Actually, let's go back to the layer scene. Okay, so I can zoom out to see a larger area. I can zoom all the way in. Okay. Then if I just use the right or sorry, the left mouse button, the main mouse button, I can select things and then I can manipulate things. So there's these manipulators, the green and red and blue things are called manipulators. And if I drag on these things, it manipulates the scene, so it changes the position of it. So I can move this up, I can move it over, I can move it across. I'm going to talk more about this area in a second, but one thing to just note real quick, all of these things are called transformations. I'm transforming the object's position in the scene. And there's an area over here under this right area is called the inspector. So we can see all the properties of each part of the scene. So if I select this mesh instance and I click on the transform, you can see those numbers change. And so the reason I'm showing you that right now is because it's really easy to reset everything if you did something you didn't want. Or actually, I don't want to do that with the rotation, but if I translate something by mistake, to get it back to where it was, I can just go over here and click that refresh. Super easy. Okay, so what? To an extent, like if I do this and then I Control Z, yeah. But if I do this and then I go do a bunch of other crap, I come back, it may run out of the undos. So yeah, so if I zoom in and out with the scroll wheel, then with the main mouse button, I can select things and manipulate things. So I can move this around. I can click on this thing and move it over here. I can click on the camera, move it around, do lots of different stuff. Okay. If I click with the scroll wheel, so I use the scroll wheel as a button instead of a scroller, I can rotate the scene around. So obviously in 3D, I'm going to do that a lot more than in other programs. So I can rotate the scene around. With the right mouse button, so the not main mouse button, I can change the view from the camera perspective. So I can rotate this way, but I can also look around like this. So then I have to do some modifiers. So if I hold Control or maybe Shift, yeah, Shift. If I use the scroll wheel and I go like this, it rotates. If I hold Shift, it pans. It moves up and down or right and left. So this is panning. So I'm holding Shift on the keyboard, going up and down, right and left. So those are kind of the main ways that I can move around. So I can rotate and pan, and I can zoom in and out. That's all using the scroll wheel. So if you have a mouse that doesn't have a scroll wheel, you really can't do most of those types of manipulations. You can actually remap everything to use different buttons if you want to. So you can customize stuff. So if you have a mouse that doesn't have a scroll wheel, you can deal with that. But that's why you really need a 3-button mouse. A couple other things you can do. If I click, there's this little rotation gizmo up here. And if I click on that, I can rotate just using the main mouse button. So I'm not using the scroll wheel here. And if I click on the axes, it'll move to the different axes. So this is like top view, front view, side view. And the red is always X, the blue is always Z, and the Y is always, or green is always Y. Talk a little bit more about the coordinate system next week when we get into more. So those are the basic manipulations. When I have an object selected, I can change what my mouse does by selecting these different tools. And there are key commands for these tools. So you can use key commands to switch between them. So this is the move tool. It means it's only going to move. So I can move the whole thing. And I can change the perspective and move around. or move up and down. And as long as I have the move tool selected, it won't rotate or do other stuff. If I have the rotate tool selected, it'll just rotate. So I can rotate on all the different axes. I can obviously do that with the main tool if I just select the rotation arcs or the transform manipulators. But if I only want to do rotation, I can switch to the rotation. And then I can also do the scale tool. So if I want to scale an object, although it's looking pretty weird now because I've done a bunch of weird stuff to it. If I want to scale an object, I can drag these. And if I go into perspective, I can scale 2x. So those are kind of my main manipulation tools. The other tools here, let's reset this. Okay. So this tool helps me select different objects. We're not going to worry about that right now. This is the lock and the deselect tool, which I already mentioned. Use local space. That's a little bit complicated. We'll talk about that later. Then I can turn this like snapping on and off. So if I have snapping on, you can see, it's hard to see from this distance, but it's snapping to these parts of the grid. Whereas if I turn this off, I can just move it wherever. And I can change the grid. How do I change the grid? 3D grid, so I can change the grid size, depths, and the color of the grid if I want to. I'm not going to worry about that, but I can change the grid if I want to. So what I did is I went to editor settings. I just typed in grid. That's kind of the easiest way to find stuff, but it's under editors, under 3D. And so I'm going to talk about the camera next, but we only have a minute left class, so I'm going to pause there, and we'll pick up on Tuesday, finish the interface, and then we will start actually making some stuff. So that's what we'll do starting Tuesday. And yeah, we'll talk about a bunch of other stuff, but we're going to stop here for today.